Hey everyone, hey Ann Shay with the Geeky In Report here. Welcome to our very first podcast. I'm glad you've decided to tune in and join us this week to listen to the subject we're going to be discussing. Since we're so new, you may be wondering, well, Geeky In Report, what are you going to be doing with this podcast? Well, what I can tell you is that the only consistent thing about us is you will never know what we're going to be doing next. We're going to have a lot of fun, and we have many surprises in store for you in the coming years. However, we will try to organize our chaos into playlists, use the proper tags, so that you won't have to swim through thousands of podcasts in order to find the subject that you've come to listen to. Today, we're going to be discussing a subject that is very dear and near to my heart, and that is cosplay. You're going to hear me talk about the subject quite a bit. I myself have been cosplaying since 1994. That long ago costume was Eve from Classic Trek's Mud's Women, and between you and me, thank goodness, there is no documentation of it that exists today. Because I'll be the first to admit, it wasn't worthy of much documentation to begin with. If you're ready, let's start with what we're going to be talking about. Let's delve into the history of the word cosplay and the history of costuming at events in general. I have noticed while surfing around that there are some gaps in the history in most articles, and that there's some misinformation as well. So we're going to try and tackle that today. I'm going to use the word cosplay throughout this podcast. For those who prefer the word costuming, then we are discussing the history of costuming at events. But I will be using the word cosplay to mean anyone who comes to a convention in costume. First off, let's talk about the history of the word cosplay itself, because this is one of the things where there is a lot of misinformation, and many people seem to believe that the word should be used for anime, manga, and Japanese-centric costuming exclusively, or not just believe it, but they actually think that that's what the word means. This is incorrect. If we go back to the creator of the word cosplay, the man's name was Nobuyuki Takahashi. Most of us know this. He defines cosplay like this, and this is a direct quote from him. Cosplay is a fan's expression of his or her love for a favorite character. Drawing a piece of artwork, writing a story, animating a movie, and showing this to others is a manifestation of that love. And cosplay is one of those expressions in which a fan uses their entire body to express that love. Personally love this definition, and I feel it really expresses what cosplay is all about. But you will notice there is no mention of any limitation on this word. No mention of genre, no mention of medium, no mention of a type of fan. It is simply a fan who is showing they love a character by dressing up. Now, in Japan at this time, there were already other words floating around to describe people who were dressing up and going to conventions. Things like hero play, costume show, kaso show. These were often seen at events. Now, the Japanese word kaso, which apparently was one of the most popular things to use, it carries a nuance of disguise and deception that really wasn't capturing the fun and the spirit of what people were doing when they wore cosplay. The first article to use the word, it was June 1983. It was the magazine My Anime. Takahashi was the author. And it was an article called Hero Costume Operation. He went to, I believe it was Comiket, and he took pictures and he did this article. And in it he uses both costume play and cosplay because they really hadn't settled on which word was going to sound better or that people would adapt. They even dabbled at trying to translate the word masquerade into Japanese because, of course, masquerade was a well-known word associated with conventions in America, but in the translation it came across as very old-fashioned sounding and very noble, and again, it was missing that fun of cosplaying. It was the use of the word cosplay during his coverage of the 1984 World Science Fiction Convention in Los Angeles. This is a very important convention. We're going to keep track of its history. That's when the word cosplay finally seems to have caught on in Japan. That's when it became widely used. Again, though, he used this word to describe everyone that he was seeing who was dressed up. It was the hall cosplay, the masquerade, the people milling outside. He used it to describe all the convention goers. The reason that so many people simply immediately assume that cosplay is an anime thing is that it was through the anime conventions in the early to mid-90s that the word cosplay found its way into the popular language. And the reason that these cons were the entrance vector for the word is that these were the people that were into Japanese culture. These were the people who spoke the language. So they were the first who became aware of the word and the first to use it in the U.S. But it's important to remember that just because the anime crowd was the first to use it in the U.S. and the word comes from Japan, again, it doesn't mean that it's anime specific. It's not if we go back to the original definition of the word. So now we've covered that. Cosplay, not just anime-centric. You can use it to describe any fan dressing up because that's the original meaning of it. I'm going to quit hitting that dead horse over the head. We're going to move on to the history part, the next history part of the section, which is going to be who invented cosplay. Again, this was something I was finding online, surprisingly. People were actually arguing, was Japan the one who invented cosplay? Was America the one that invented cosplay? And again, I think the reason people are arguing that Japan invented cosplay is the misinformation and belief that cosplay means anime costuming. And if you want to get to there, then yes, of course Japan invented the first anime costumes because anime comes from Japan. But when it came to costuming at an event, this was done very first in the U.S. Now let's set our way back machines, not as far back as we will eventually go in this podcast, but fairly far back, and we're going to find ourselves at the first World Science Fiction Convention. If we want to discuss specifically going to a convention in costume, then this is it. And it's pretty well known. It's pretty well known that the people we are going to be discussing will be Myrtle Douglas and Forrest Ackerman. Now, most people just say Forrest Ackerman or refer to him first because he's so well known in the fandom. He was a fan and very active his whole life. But it was actually Myrtle Douglas who created the costumes that they wore. She was wearing a satin jumper, he had on pants, a shirt with wide shoulders, very Art Nouveau, and a cape. And she made these costumes from an old ball gown. Now, the reason most people don't know her name is that she didn't stay involved in the fandom after she and Ackerman broke up sometime in the 40s or early 50s. But we have to give credit where credit is due. She did create the first costumes worn to a science fiction convention. And many people nowadays are calling her the mother of cosplay. And I'm not going to disagree. This is not a wrong title. Ackerman referred to these costumes that they wore, it was July of 1939 in New York, he referred to them as futuristic costumes. That's one big word, no space in between, no two C's. And these costumes were inspired by the 1936 British dystopian science fiction movie, Things to Come. And that was a movie that was from an H.G. Wells story. He was apparently surprised to find out that he and his girlfriend were the only two people of all 200 attendees that year to be dressed up. He would later say that he had just assumed people would be dressed up at such an event, which makes me smile because it's very forward-thinking if you think about it, because there's no precedence for this. There had never been a science fiction convention before. So how does one know or assume that everyone's going to be dressed up? I mean, he even came on the train in the costume. There are pictures of him wearing it on the platform, greeting people. He walked the streets of Manhattan in it. 1939. That doesn't strike you as quite the year where anyone would think it would be normal to show up in public, decked out in this futuristic costume, and proclaiming that you are an alien from the future, which is what Ackerman did. FDR was still president. We'd just come out of the Depression. Pearl Harbor hadn't happened yet. So it is a pretty long time ago, although it was the perfect time in many, many ways, especially considering that the World Fair that year, which was happening at the same time in New York, its theme was building the world of tomorrow. Perfect time to hold a science fiction convention. For those of you wondering, this is not the same event that you see during Captain America. Captain America takes place during 1943. This is 1939. Now we're going to set our time machines to way back. We are going 31 years before Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas wore their outfits, their futuristic costumes, to the World Science Fiction Convention. Because if we're going to give credit to the first public appearance of someone wearing a sci-fi costume, shockingly but true, it was in 1908. 1908! Mr. and Mrs. William Fell attended a masquerade at a skating rink in Cincinnati, Ohio. Their costumes were based on a comic strip. The characters were by the company A.D. Kondo, and it was Mr. Skygack and Miss Dill Pickles. Now, in 1908, again, you're talking that next year will be the 110th anniversary of this event, of the very first people to appear in public in science fiction costumes. World War I was still several years away. Titanic hadn't been built. And the first Roosevelt, Theodore, was president of the United States. We've gone pretty far back here. And it continues. It continues. In 1910, the first person to win a masquerade who was wearing a sci-fi costume happened. 1910, Tacoma, Washington. A young woman came dressed as who else? Mr. Skygack. It's really a testament to how popular that comic was. I'm going to have to go look this up. A funny little side note to this is that a friend of hers borrowed that costume later on to help promote, what else? A skating rink. This is exactly the kind of event where Mr. and Mrs. William Fell appeared 2 years prior. Skating rinks were definitely where people gathered in the early part of the century to socialize. That particular gentleman, unfortunately, was arrested for parading around in a masquerade costume in public. Apparently, it was some kind of city ordinance in Tacoma, Washington, that it was illegal to dress in costume and be on the streets. It makes me wonder, it makes me want to go and look up and see if that's still on the books, because, you know, they tend to leave those kind of silly laws for a very long time on the books. But that would be a whole other podcast. You're looking into silly laws that are still on the books. That's a whole other podcast. But yes, convention-wise, wearing a costume, we have to give credit to Myrtle Douglas and Forrest Ackerman. The first masquerade at a convention, that was held the following year in 1940. And of course, all conventions and most cultural events were suspended till the end of World War II. Of course, we do know that baseball games were still going on and things of this nature. But other events were kind of suspended because, again, they didn't want large groups of people getting together and it being a target for the enemy. There was that fear. Now, at this time period as well, if you want to go then about 1945 forward into the 1960s, the kind of costumes you are seeing at these conventions are original costumes that are inspired by, possibly some comic strip costumes. And the reason that this was that they didn't have the reference material that we have nowadays, or that came later in the 60s, to make their costumes by. A person would go, let's say you went to the movies and you went to see Forbidden Planet and you went, oh, Altair's dress, I want to wear that. What does that dress really look like? You saw it once on the screen. You might go and study the lobby cards that are in the lobby, but unless you have the money to go and watch that movie several times and maybe bring a pad and pencil, paper and pencil, and start drawing the costume out, but unless you were going to do that, it was very hard to figure out reference material and what did that costume really look like, except to go by your memory. So up until the 1960s, costumes were very much inspired by or original sci-fi costumes. Now in 1962, we're going to jump over to Japan because we're running parallel because of the word cosplay. The first Nihon Science Fiction Taikai happened in Tokyo. That was also called MegaCon. They tend to give nicknames to their conventions each year. So the very first science fiction convention in Japan happened in 1962. Then you come back over to America. Now 1966 was a banner year for science fiction costuming. Star Trek came on. And this was, of course, the first hugely popular science fiction show on the air. Now, Lost in Space had been airing since the year before, and it was popular, but not to the heights that was attained by Star Trek. And Batman, Adam West, Burt Ward, they were on as Batman and Robin in 1966. So finally, here were very popular shows with characters in costume, and it was on weekly, so you could watch and you could draw these costumes, you could make reference to them, and you could really recreate what was being shown on the television. So 1966, very important year for costuming and conventions. 1972 saw the first Star Trek convention, the first official Star Trek convention. Gene Roddenberry, of course, appeared at TriCon in 1966 to promote Star Trek. In 1975, we're going to jump across the waters again, and Comic-Con, which is probably one of the most famous conventions in Japan, began. And that's also the year that Space Battleship Yamato came on TV, the anime series, 1974-1975. And as it's described by one of the first Japanese cosplayers, Hideaki Ito, he says these are the years when you first see cosplay in Japan. Space Battleship Yamato, known as Star Blazers, occasionally over here in the U.S., that's where it really all began. That was the show that inspired people to go out to conventions and dress up. This is from an interview with ourstarblazers.com. And they asked him, did cosplay exist before this? And he said, no. 1976, 1977. 77 was, of course, when Star Wars came out and when the movie for Space Battleship Yamato came out. This is when you first see cosplayers appearing at conventions. And he even says that he was referred to as that weird guy that did full cosplay. So it was still something that, weird to the people to see someone dressed up. Prior to that, he said you would occasionally see people dress up when the fan clubs got together, but not before that. And he really had his fingers on the pulse of fandom. He was 18 years old, living in Tokyo. He was a doujinshi artist, and he was a member of the Yamato Association, which was the official Space Battleship Yamato fan club. So one of the first cosplayers. He tells a story that, you want dedication, he spent 6 months carving out of wood the Cosmo gun from Star Blazers. That's some pretty serious dedication, and it's a beautiful piece. It is a beautiful piece if you get to see the pictures. They are online. Jumping back over to the U.S., 1979, the first anime cosplayers appeared in America. I believe it was Karen Schnaubelt. I'm going to pronounce that wrong, and you can correct me on her name. I do apologize for not having that completely down. That's kind of wrong of me. You did see nudity banned from the conventions. There was a time during the 70s and early 80s where there were costumes where people were showing up full nude, and it was not allowed at conventions anymore. Then we're going to go back over to Japan for the 1983 My Anime article. 1984's World Science Fiction Event, as we've already discussed. Nobuyuki Takahashi used the word cosplay to describe the event goers. 1990s, you see the word actually come over to America. Cosplay's got a little better. More reference material started showing up. 1996, the first documentary about cosplay was released in Japan. That was the Cosplay Encyclopedia. And that's where we're going to actually end, because if you were born in the 1990s or after, you kind of know what's happened. Cosplay's become big business. It's huge. It's huge everywhere. It's a worldwide event, and entire industries are supported by it now. You have wig companies specifically for cosplay, you have clothing companies inspired by cosplay, you have cosplay magazines, you have huge contests with huge prizes, you have TV shows, and honestly, who knows where it will go tomorrow. And this has been so fascinating for me to watch as cosplay has grown up in front of me. And I do believe that the 90s to 2000s, you've seen so much growth, so much change from the early days of cosplay. So, okay, history lesson is now over. Are there any questions? Now, if you do have any questions, or if you think I've missed something, an important milestone in convention or cosplay history, something you feel I should have mentioned, definitely let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear from you. I'll reply if I can. And until next time and next subject, continue to have fun, enjoy yourselves, and we'll be seeing you soon. This is Hey Aunt Shay with the Geekian Report, signing off.